Hi Year 12, welcome back to your next revision session with me. Today we are looking at James's religious policies, his aims, how he went about to carry out his aims, and how successful they were to the different religious groups in the country at the time. The first thing I want to do though before we start to look at James's religious policies is just quickly recap James's foreign policy aims and some of the key events that took part throughout James's reign in relation to his foreign policy. So you need a pen and paper, 1 to 11. I know 11 is a bit of a stupid number to have for a quiz, but anyway, and answer these questions for me, please. So pause me now, quick quiz, let's see how many you can answer, and then I'll go through the answers afterwards. Okay, answers. Sorry, for some reason I was able to highlight these ones yellow, but then for others I wasn't, so sorry if this is a bit confusing. It hasn't come, I'd copied it from a Word document from a quiz that I normally give you, but it didn't copy very well, which is a bit annoying. Okay, so first question. Give 3 aims of James's foreign policy. Aim number 1, he wanted to keep England out of war. 2, he wanted to secure marriage alliances, particularly with Spain and Germany. And 3, James wanted to be seen as a mediator of Europe. He wanted to have an influential role in European diplomacy. 2, what term did James apply to himself, meaning that he was a peace-loving king? That term is Rex Specificus. 3, give the name and date of the peace treaty signed with Spain at the beginning of James's reign. That was the 1604 Treaty of London. Give the name of the most powerful Catholic family, royal family in Europe. That was the Habsburgs. Which crisis sparked the 30 Years' War? That was the Palatinate crisis, which leads into the next question. Which throne was Frederick of the Palatinate offered? This is when Frederick of the Palatinate married to Elizabeth Stuart, James's daughter. He is already ruler of the Palatinate. He is then offered the throne or the crown of Bohemia. He foolishly accepts it, even though he's advised not to, and that tips the scales across the European states in terms of the number of states that have Protestant rulers and the number of states that have Catholic rulers, and that then sparks the 30 Years' War. So it's also known as the Palatinate crisis. 7. Why was it unusual for James to allow Parliament to discuss foreign policy in 1621? Foreign policy was a royal prerogative matter. Therefore, technically, James didn't need to discuss his aims or his ideas in terms of what he wanted to do with foreign policy. But Parliament argued against that and said that if you want our money to fund your foreign policy, then you should discuss your foreign policy aims with us. 8. What action did Parliament want to take during the Palatinate crisis? They wanted an alliance with the Dutch and they wanted a sea war. Very important, that particular part there. A sea war. Predominantly against the Catholics of Europe and Spain, and against the Habsburgs, which had run Frederick and Elizabeth out of the Palatinate, taken it from them. 9. What 2 actions did James want to take during the Palatinate crisis? He wanted to use Parliament to negotiate with the Spanish, and then, if this failed, he wanted to launch a land expedition to the Palatinate with the Dutch to help win it back. So you can see how his aims don't quite match up with the aims of Parliament. Number 10. In which year was Charles and Buckingham's trip to Madrid? That was 1623. And number 11. How much did the 1624 Parliament vote to fund a sea war against Spain? That was 300,000. We know that James wasted that. He wasted £60,000 of that by investing in the Mansfeld expedition. Parliament said, don't get off the boat, this is a naval war, and he got off the boat, and it was a big waste of money and didn't really succeed in anything. Right, so let's move on. Before we start to think about James's aims, we need to have a quick recap of the different religious groups that were predominant throughout this time period. So I've put a list down the side here of some key groups, and then I've put the definitions on the other side and they don't match, so you have to match them up. Normally I would print this off and you would draw a little line to it, but obviously we can't do that, so you might just want to number them. I've done the first one for you. So a Calvinist. Calvinists were followers of the teachings of John Calvin, who set up a strict non-hierarchical church. They encouraged church services and they believed in predestination. That's a word we've not talked about in a while. Predestination was an idea that when you are born, you are predestined, that your fate has already been decided. So no matter how good you are throughout your life, your end destination, be that heaven or hell, has already been decided for you. So number the rest of these, and then, oh, whoa, what's happening there? Stay still. Number the rest of these and then match them up to their definitions on the side, please. So pause me now, match them up, and then we'll go through the answers. Answers. So Puritans are down here. Puritans were a form of Calvinists. They resented bishops because they strongly did not like church hierarchy. They were a minority group, particularly during the reign of James, but they were a vocal one. Puritans loathed Catholics. They were quite frightened of them, and they really saw them as being almost like the Antichrist. Catholics follow the order of the Pope as God's representative on earth. However, I think it's important to remember and to keep in the back of your mind that Catholics were only accounted for about 5% of the population within England during this time period. So Catholics were very much perceived as being a threat, particularly by groups such as Puritans, but actually they were a small minority during this time period. Next one, Arminians down here. Arminians were anti-Calvinist. They wanted more elaborate services. They saw bishops as being special. They did not accept the authority of the Pope, but they placed high value on the power of the crown, and that is why James liked them so much. So Arminians are an unusual group in the sense of they are a Protestant group. They certainly don't see themselves as Catholic, but yet when you look at some of their traits here, the push for more elaborate services, they saw bishops as being special, that would fall under a Catholic definition. So some of their practices were seen as being dangerously close to Catholicism, but actually they were a Protestant group. In it, probably being the most important part is that they don't follow the authority of the Pope, but they do strictly follow the authority of the crown, which is why throughout his reign, James starts to build quite a strong bond with many Arminians, and he promotes them, much to the dislike of Parliament. And then when James dies, Charles very much carries on that trend, and that's what we see sort of in the build-up to the Civil War, with Puritan Parliament versus Charles, his Arminian tendencies, and the Arminians that he surrounded himself with. Presbyterians at the bottom here. Majority of them form the Scottish Church. They follow similar ideas to Calvinists. They do not have bishops, but they also don't support the crown as the head of the church either. Jesuits formed a group known as the Society of Jesus. They were extremist Roman Catholics. They were converts and missionaries. They saw it as their idea to try and win people back over to the true Catholic faith. They were considered radical and dangerous. And finally, Anglicans here. These formed the majority of the church members in England. They accepted bishops and they had a worship centred on communion. So if you can remember this, you probably can't. It's one of the first lessons we ever did, and I gave you like a little picture of a seesaw, and we put our Catholics on one side and our Protestants on the other. Anglicans were deemed as being a middle way, a via media, a form of Protestantism that was seen to be not too stringently Protestant. So it was a type of Protestantism that Catholics might be able to follow. And that was what the majority of people in England classed themselves as, Anglicans. Okay, so what were James's religious aims? Get these down for me, please. James wanted to avoid religious tension, and he wanted to try and include as many people as possible into the national church. He was prepared to make some form of concessions, and we see that quite early on in his reign. I'll come to that in a second, for both Catholics and Protestants, but not extremists. James despised religious extremists. He referred to Jesuits as venomous wasps, and radical Puritans as being Puritan papists. Remember, a papist is someone who follows the authority of the Pope, and obviously if you're a Puritan you don't follow the authority of the Pope, so that is kind of just like a bit of a bitchy comment. James made clear from the start that he would aim to be tolerant. He said, "I will not persecute any that will be quiet and give outward obedience." That is in a similar kind of tone to what we saw with Elizabeth. She said that she wasn't interested in building windows into men's souls. So as long as on the outside you were doing what you were supposed to be doing, you were going to your church services, you weren't speaking badly about the crown or about the national church, you were perceived as being a conformist, someone that just fitted in with everybody else, as long as you did that on the outside, Elizabeth said she wasn't bothered what you felt on the inside. So even if on the inside you felt you were a Catholic, and when you got home you read the Bible in Latin, and you might read private mass, you can't do that publicly, but as long as you're doing it quietly on the inside, Elizabeth said she was fine with that. And we can see James here following a similar sort of theme. Quiet, outward obedience, and I won't hunt you down, I won't persecute you. And he also said, no blood should be shed over diversity in religious opinion, which again, we know James doesn't want bloodshed because he despised war, particularly religious war. And also this part here about religious opinion, this feeds in quite nicely to this final point. We know that James was a well-read monarch. He's enthusiastically encouraged religious debate far more than we saw with previous monarchs. He really was ahead of his contemporaries. He was actively open to engage in conversation with people about how he could aid them religiously. What is it that you want me to do? How can I support you? That's certainly not me saying that James then did everything he could that was asked of him, because he certainly didn't. But he did, to some extent, aid those that had asked for his help, and he did make some changes to try and include as many people as he possibly could within the national church. So, next thing I want you to do is James Knowledge Organiser. It's these 3 pages that you need. So this is just a little general introduction. Then it talks about, sorry, this has been slow today, James and the Puritans, and then James and the Catholics. So give that a read, refresh your memory, highlight, make a few notes, and then once you've spent half an hour or so recapping over that, then come back to me. Okay, so let's start with Catholics. Initial success and failures for Catholic tolerance. When James became king, he did make clear that he strived for tolerance, particularly towards Catholics, who he'd thought had had quite a rough time under the reign of Elizabeth. We know, thinking back to last lesson, that James was super keen to build bridges with Catholic countries abroad, such as Spain. One of the first things he did in 1604 was signing the Treaty of London to reopen trade barriers that had been blocked between England and Spain for so many years during Elizabeth's reign. So James didn't just want it to be European Catholics that he had on board, he wanted also, to some extent, to appease Catholics at home. When James was crowned, Catholics within England felt almost a sense of hope that James would be a different type of king, that he'd got this reputation for being a tolerant man, and they hoped that that would kind of trickle down and have an impact on them as well. And initially, James did stick to his tolerant reputation, recusancy fines were reduced. So just as a recap, if you've forgotten, a recusant is someone who refuses to go to Sunday service. So really that's a Catholic, because the Sunday service leaned more towards Protestantism. Again, it's that via media, that middle way. It was a service that was created for Protestants, but not so strongly Protestant that Catholics would refuse to go altogether. You had to go to Sunday service, or you were deemed a recusant and you were charged a recusancy fine. These were greatly reduced. They fell to less than a quarter of their level before James had acceded the throne. Recusancy fines could cripple families because they were so high, and a lot of Catholics deemed that they were unfair. So James did reduce these initially. But, as you can see, in the abrupt change of colour, this tolerance was quite short-lived for a variety of different reasons. In 1604, all priests and Jesuits were ordered to forcibly leave the country. They were told that they were expelled, they had to leave. In November 1604, recusancy fines were ordered to be collected in full again. But this abrupt change in policy perhaps doesn't necessarily shine a light on James's tolerance. Perhaps more it shines a light on parliamentary reaction to James's tolerance. In 1604, Parliament pushed for harsher punishments against recusants, and James was eager to not antagonise Parliament so early on within his reign, so he gave in to that request. But actually, in the end, this backfired on James, because this abrupt change in policy dashed hopes for Catholic tolerance and had quite a severe reaction, which we'll come back to in a second. So, find and fix. Normally I'd print these sheets out, but obviously I can't do that, so you'll have to maybe just number them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 and do it that way. There are 9 errors within this information, so I'd like you to read each box, find the error and then fix it. So something within these sentences is wrong. There's no trick ones, so there's none in here there's no boxes that are completely right. They all have something wrong with them. So you might just want to number them, and then like next to number 1, write what the error is, and then fix it for me please, and then I'll go through them. So pause me now, find the errors and fix them. Right, answers. Number 1. Catholics hoped for tolerance once James was crowned, but James was not initially interested in this. We know that's not true. Actually, James strived for tolerance, particularly in the very early years of his reign. So initially, James was interested in tolerance. 2. Recusancy fines were introduced to tackle extreme Protestantism across the country. Not true. Recusancy fines were for Catholics. Recusancy fines were increased as soon as James was crowned king. No, they were actually reduced. They fell to a quarter of their level in comparison to the throne before James inherited the crown from Elizabeth. 4. In 1610, all priests and Jesuits were ordered to leave the country. Wrong. That was in 1604, all priests and Jesuits were ordered to leave the country. And in November 1604, recusancy fines were ordered to be collected in full. 5. James was dedicated to the Presbyterian faith, as this was dominant in Scotland. It's where he was raised. Well, I wouldn't really call that a trick question, but I'd be keen to see how many of you got that one right or wrong. James was not supportive of the Presbyterian faith, even though James was Scottish and was raised in Scotland. He did not support Presbyterianism. James was a Calvinist. He supported an Episcopal church system. So he did not believe in the idea that you shouldn't have bishops. He believed in a hierarchy, which is essentially this idea here. Church episcopacy just means the fact that you would have bishops and you have different stages, different levels to your church, with obviously the crown being at the top of that, and then below your archbishops and your bishops. So there's structure and order to it. James very much liked that. He was a big supporter of that. So obviously other more radical groups like Puritans that didn't believe in church structure, James wasn't a massive fan of them. Next one. 1603, Puritans handed James the Millenary Petition, signed by 1,000 members of the clergy asking for more Puritan reforms. James refused to meet with them to discuss their issues. Well, this was wrong. James was keen to meet them, and shortly afterwards he arranged for the Hampton Court Conference in January 1604 to discuss some of the key issues presented in the Millenary Petition. 1611, James recommissioned the Elizabethan Book of Common Prayer. Wrong. James commissioned a new Bible known as the King James Bible in 1611. This was considered to be one of the greatest successes of his entire reign. And this version of the Bible lasted for hundreds and hundreds of years after James's death. One of the main reasons why he commissioned the King James Bible was because several different religious groups argued that the Elizabethan Book of Common Prayer was far too vague, and it was deliberately written vague so that people could interpret it in whatever ways they wanted to. People argued that the Bible needed to be slightly more set in stone, and James did do that. Last two, the Westminster Court Conference was held in January 1604. Wrong, it was the Hampton Court Conference. And last one, there were 4 Catholic plots against James: the Bye plot, the Main plot, the Parliament plot, and the Gunpowder plot. Well, that is wrong. Hopefully you will have been able to notice that there were only 3 plots. The Parliament plot was not real. I made it up. Okay, last bit. Thinking about James and reactions towards Puritans, just as a quick recap, because the Hampton Court Conference and the Millenary Petition tends to be some of the sections that people forget. The Hampton Court Conference was organised because Puritans had drafted the Millenary Petition. They presented it to James, and they'd actually presented it to him when he was making his way from Scotland to England to be crowned king. That's how quickly they got in there. And from this, James decided to hold the Hampton Court Conference, where he would invite members from different churches to come, hash out their problems and discuss what could be done to try and create a more harmonious environment between these different groups. Depending on whose opinion you take, some historians argue that the Hampton Court Conference was a great failure and that it didn't actually result in any real lasting change. But to be honest, I think that is maybe a little bit harsh. The fact that James was willing to hold it within itself shows that he was quite progressive in his thinking. But they are right in the sense of a lot of the more radical Puritans felt as though their ideas had been ignored. So discussions were generally harmonious and there was actually much agreement, although it's said that throughout the conference James still remained slightly hostile towards Puritans, and he could get in a bit of a grump and a bit of a mood and bicker with some of them. A new version of the Bible was to be created, known as the King James Bible, which was published in 1611, which was a great success. But Puritans were still not pleased. None of their demands had been accepted, and the reason for that was they were considered to be too extreme, too radical. So some of the things that the Puritans had asked for was to stop using a ring in marriage ceremonies. They believed it was popish and superstitious, and also bowing in church when the name Jesus was said. Again, they believed that to be popish. It's not in the Bible, therefore if it's not written in the Bible you shouldn't do it. But James wasn't interested. So a lot of the more radical members felt as though the conference had been a bit of a waste of their time, that this had been written in the Millenary Petition and it had been ignored. James remained concerned that if he gave too much, it would belittle his overall power. So, for example, whenever church hierarchy was challenged or mentioned, James made it very clear that the Hampton Court Conference was not arranged to discuss church structure. It was arranged to discuss church abuses, and he continually made comment to that whenever hierarchy was mentioned. Presbyterianism and the idea of not having bishops was mentioned, even though James had told them that that's not what they were there to discuss. James threw massive paddy, slammed his hands on the table and famously shouted, "No bishops, no king." He was very paranoid about the fact that if they didn't have that level, if you imagine it as being like a triangle, like a hierarchy, James is at the very top of that triangle, and directly below are the bishops to support the monarch. If you remove the bishops, then that makes James more accountable for religion, and he thought that that made him vulnerable to attack and to more radical groups. So he believed, James was quite a paranoid guy, but within reason, to be honest. His dad was blown up in a gunpowder attack, and then he almost receives a similar fate a few years later. So to be fair, maybe there is some justification in his paranoia. But with this paranoia, he believed that the only way to keep himself safe and to maintain the crown was to keep hierarchy within religion. Overall, James hoped to win over the more moderate Puritans and leave extremists well alone. Very few extremist Puritans were invited to the Hampton Court Conference. Most of them were turned away. They were not allowed to come. It was only Puritans that were seen to be slightly more flexible were invited. And James had said, "I will make them conform, or I will harry them out of this island. So either do as you're told, or you will be forced to leave," which we do know that does actually come about for Catholics too. So some of the agreed reforms, again, this is all very much abuses related, not necessarily structure. Pluralism was limited. Pluralism is when a member of the church can own more than one church, so it's literally a plural, more than one. It was a crime, you weren't allowed to have more than one church because you were considered as being sort of limited to your flock, like if you're running a church in Barney but also running a church in Staindrop as well, your time's going to be split between the people of those two areas, so it wasn't allowed. Bishops were to be limited in terms of, I've said here, less power, but that doesn't mean less power over everything. It was more to do with the law. So before bishops could work on legal cases, they had to consult lawyers and solicitors and that sort of thing. So that's the way that it was presented, as though that bishops were given less power, but really their power in terms of the hierarchy stayed the same. New translation of the Bible, and reforms were to be made to the Court of High Commission, which again links in with the element of law and order within the church. So last thing that I want you to do is use your little textbook, pages 31 to 32. Why were Arminians so unpopular? And we'll come back to this at the start of the next revision session. Why did their influence grow throughout James's reign? And how did James deal with religious issues in Scotland and Ireland? Okay, so that's it from me. Thank you very much for tuning in, and I'll speak to you again later.